Alright, so we're going to talk about opportunity cost, and this is basically what you're going to begin to talk about if you take any sort of macroeconomics class. You're going to start with opportunity cost, and then you're going to move on to comparative advantage. So we're going to cover both of those right now. So opportunity cost is the idea that every choice you make, there's another choice, or at least another best alternative choice that you could have made. So let's say you spend 8 hours sleeping, you could have spent 8 hours researching or something. It's a simple concept. It's just whatever you do. You eat a sandwich, you could have eaten a hot dog, So it's the idea that there are other choices that you can make, which you probably already know, and that the opportunity cost of the choice that you do end up making, say eating a hot dog, is the cost of the next best alternative, which would be, say, eating a sandwich. So comparative advantage kind of works alongside of that. In comparative advantage, you often see these graphs, so I haven't actually labeled anything yet, but once I do, they're going to be called the production possibilities frontier, or curve. You're going to see this on the exam most likely, and any sort of test. It's probably going to be the first graph you see. I'd imagine maybe you'd see aggregate supply and aggregate demand first, but I don't think so. I think you'd see production possibilities frontier. So, like I said, opportunity cost basically works with two things that you can do. So, like I said, eating a hot dog or eating a sandwich. So on the graph, you have two axes. So we're going to label them two different things. Now, let's say that these are two countries, right? So this is country A. And as you can see, I'm getting used to learning a Wacom. And this is country B. Still haven't gotten it down. So, country A and country B, they can produce two goods. And let's say that they're a farming nation and all they have are goats. So what can goats really do? Goats can make cheese. God, this is really bad. They can make cheese. So cheese is going to be the y-axis good. And notice that this is a graph, so there is going to be some sort of relationship between these two goods. So they can make cheese, or they can make milk. Goats probably can do more. I mean, they can make babies, but it's hard to trade a baby for milk, I find. So milk and cheese is what we're going to go with along the dairy line here. So they can make cheese or milk. All right, so let's say country A has a combination that looks something like this, right? So they can make more cheese than they can make milk. Now, notice on the AP exams, oftentimes they'll try to trick you up. So you really have to look at the numbers. Oh, excuse me here. You really have to look at the numbers. So let's say a potential trick that they could do is basically do something like this and just have 100 here and 100 here, and make it look as if they can make more cheese, but in reality, it's either 100 cheese or 100 milk. But we're not going to trick you up today, because this is, your first lesson in opportunity cost. So we're going to say they can make either, let's do 50 and 100. So this is going to be 100. Okay. 100 cheese or 50 milk. And then country B, let's say they're more prone to making milk. They can make, let's do 150 milk. So they can make 150 milk. It's quite a bit. Make 150 milk. Or let's say 100 cheese. And I'm going to cut and I'll just put that because I'm having trouble actually using this program. Alright, so I changed my mind. They're going to make 150 milk or 50 cheese. So what does this even really mean? It means that with all their resources used or allocated efficiently, sometimes they like to say, they can make either 50 cheese and 0 milk. So notice how this point, if it was on a coordinate plane, this point would be oh sorry, I'm still on the line thing. This point would be 0 because you're making 0 of the x-axis good, and then your y-intercept would be 100. So this point is 0, 100, which represents 0 milk and then 100 cheese. The measurements could be, pounds or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just milk or cheese. So you can make 0 units of milk and 100 cheese, or they can make 50 units of milk and then 0 cheese. Notice how 50 on the x, 0 on the y. or any combination in between. Okay, and then country B can do the same thing. They can make 0 milk and then 50 cheese. Or they can make 150 milk and then 0 cheese. Okay, you feel me? So, judging by this, who has the absolute advantage in producing what good? So, what even is absolute advantage? Well, absolute advantage, alright, I'm just going to abbreviate it, abs advantage. I'm actually going to cut and make this a little fancier. Alright, so absolute advantage is the idea that you can simply produce more. Okay, so it doesn't have to deal with comparative advantage, it just has to deal with the numerical amount that you can produce. So who can produce more cheese? Well, it's going to be country A, because country A can produce 100 cheese using all of its resources. So, A has an absolute advantage in cheese, alright? Now, if A has an absolute advantage in cheese, that does not necessarily mean that B has to have an absolute advantage in milk. That is the case for here, but oftentimes country A could have an absolute advantage in both products. You could have 100 cheese and then 100 milk. Or sorry, 100 cheese and then like 200 milk in this case. You'd have an absolute advantage in both, but you'd still have differing comparative advantages, and we'd go into that. So, what does country B have an absolute advantage? Well, if you look, what can they produce the most of? Well, country B can produce 150 milk, whereas country A can produce only 50 milk. So, country B has an absolute advantage in milk production here. Alright? So, now, what is this graph? I know that we already went over the points, but what point would represent efficiency? So I'm going to draw 3 points out here. I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit of questions, and we'll see if you get them right or wrong. Okay, so on the graph of A, what point represents efficiency? Well, you should say Y, because this whole line shows a relationship between cheese and milk, given that all resources are used efficiently. So, any point on the line of a production possibilities curve naturally has to be resources that are allocated efficiently. I don't know why that was hard for me to say. So, resource allocation that's efficient, it's going to be any point that's on the curve. So what's a point within the curve? Well, that's a point where resources are not allocated efficiently because you're inwards in a curve. Oftentimes on AP exams, they'll say something about like a recession. So if country A is in a recession, what point could be representative of the recession? That would be Z, because you're inside the production possibilities curve, so you're not producing as much as you could if you were on the line. Let's say that like this point, was like 25.50 or something. Or sorry, would it be 25.50? This would only be like 20.10 or something ridiculous. So they're not producing at full efficiency. Again, they'd like to say something like a recession. Point X, however, is impossible at current times. At the current productive capacity of the economy, point X is impossible. Now, there are factors that will shift the production possibilities curve, which we will go into probably in this video as well. Okay, so now we're going to do comparative advantage. I'm going to draw a little box thing, and then we're going to do it. All right, so comparative advantage is the idea of opportunity cost. So opportunity cost and comparative advantage go hand in hand. Whenever they ask a question about opportunity cost, oftentimes it's going to have to deal with comparative advantage, especially on these FRQs. So let's see the different productive capacities of country A and B. So I have abbreviated C for cheese and M for milk. So how much cheese can country A produce? Well, it's 100. So A can produce 100 cheese. How much cheese can country B produce? Well, it's only 50. So B can produce 50 cheese. Now, notice, comparative advantage and absolute advantage do not have to be related. So your absolute advantage doesn't have to be your comparative advantage. You can have an absolute advantage in both products, but you can only have a comparative advantage in one product. So if you ever see a question and one of the answers is A has a comparative advantage in both goods, automatically cross it out. It's wrong all the time. It's never going to be right. So let's look at A's milk production. So A can produce 50 milk, while B can produce 150 milk. All right, so now we're going to look at the relative values of the milk and the cheese. So let me actually draw these parentheses a little bit nicer. So what do I mean by that? I mean, how much milk do you give up when you make one cheese, and how much cheese do you give up when you make one milk? So for every cheese you make, you lose out on half a milk. And the reason why is because 100 times 1/2 gives you 50. So to find the opportunity cost of cheese, you just do the productive capacity of cheese. So that's 100 x, and then x is the opportunity cost equals how much milk you have, 50. So divide both sides by 100. 50 divided by 100 is going to be 1/2. So every cheese you make, you give up on 1/2 milk. So 1c equals 1/2 m. All right, and then conversely, every milk you make gives up how much cheese? So 50x equals 100. Well, x is going to be 2. So 1 milk equals 2 cheese. Okay? So now let's do that for B. So B can make 50 cheese or 150 milk. So 50x equals 150. So 1 cheese equals 3 milk. Okay? And then you may start to see a pattern here. Sorry, I do double parentheses. Shouldn't have done that. You may start to see a pattern here where the opportunity cost of one good is a sort of inverse of the other good. So 1/2 and 2, 3, and then this is going to be 1/3. So 1 milk equals 1/3 cheese. And the reason why, again, is that, let me make that 3 better. The reason why, again, is that 150 times 1/3 is going to give you 50. Okay, so what does this even really mean? What you got to look at is the lowest opportunity cost. And why would you want the lowest? Well, it's sort of like in golf. Okay, you want the lowest opportunity cost because let's look at country A for a second here. So one cheese, for every cheese you give up, you only give up 1/2 of a milk. So every cheese you make, you give up 1/2 of a milk, whereas every milk you make, you give up 2 whole cheeses. Okay, so you're giving up more whenever you're making 50 milk than you are when you're making 100 cheese, because every 1 cheese is 1/2 milk, so that's less than 2. So you want to look at these two values and determine which one is the lowest. So this is the lowest here. Okay. And then let's look at these two. So for B, it's 1 cheese is 3 milk. Well, okay, so every 1 cheese you make, you lose 3 milk. That's quite a bit. And then for milk, every 1 milk, you only lose 1/3 cheese. So that means that you're actually doing better when you make a milk because you're losing less. Your opportunity cost is lower. So to put this into another perspective, let's say every house you build, you could build 50 condos. Okay, so then every condo you make, you could build 1/50th of a house, right? So what are you going to be doing? You're going to be building those condos, because that's just a better deal. All right. So A has a comparative advantage in cheese production because it has a lower opportunity cost, which is 1/2, whereas B has a comparative advantage in milk production because B has the lower comparative advantage of 1/3. So this is going to be the combination that you're going to be looking at is between A and B. So with specialization in trade, this is another thing they like to ask. Specialization in trade basically just means that the country's going to specialize in the good of their comparative advantage and export that good. So country A would be specializing in cheese and only producing cheese, while country B would be specializing in milk and only producing milk. So that means that country A would be exporting cheese and importing milk because your import's going to be your comparative disadvantage or what you don't have a comparative advantage in. So since A doesn't have a comparative advantage in milk, it's going to be importing milk and exporting cheese, whereas B is going to be exporting milk and importing cheese. All right. So Another way to do comparative advantage is you just make these charts, right? So 150, 50, 150, and then you just cross multiply and see which number is the greatest. So 100 times 150 is definitely going to be larger than 50 times 50. So that means that the combination with 150 is going to be both with a comparative advantage. So that means that A is going to have a comparative advantage in cheese, and B is going to have a comparative advantage in milk. So factors that shifts the production possibilities curve. This is a little fast, but we got to keep on going here. So a shift of the production possibilities curve just means that it's either going to shift outwards or it's going to shift inwards. All right. So factors that will shift the curve inwards could be that you're that you're not in a recession, because a recession is just for a temporary thing, but this has to be a long-standing change in either the labor force or productivity. So factors that could shift the production possibilities curve inward is, say, a huge percentage of your labor force just dies. Okay, so that means that your production capacity just is gone for a very long time. Now, if you're on the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, production possibilities curve is very similar to the long-run aggregate supply, but we'll go into that later. So, factors that will shift the curve outwards are things like an increase in education, so increase E, an increase in productivity, an increase in technology. And technology means basically like efficiency, and productivity means like units per worker or something, like output per worker. And education, they like to say quality or quantity of education, but just education. Or an increase in capital goods. So if you have more capital goods, that's one thing that they like to do. You can actually, with more capital goods, you can produce more. Also, another thing is increase in investment. Kind of goes along with the capital goods. So oftentimes you'll see that with interest rates, if interest rates go down, investment goes up, and then long run growth will also go up because you're investing in the economy. And that's basically it for today. We'll go into comparative advantage in trade later, but I feel like this is a little bit to swallow. Comparative advantage in trade, basically, I might just do it right now. It's going to be really quick, so don't pay attention to this if you don't care. Trade is the idea that you'll just trade one good for another, obviously. So let's say you're going to trade one cheese for some amount of milk. So you're going to look at the combinations of cheese and milk. So between the two countries, the relative value of cheese is anywhere between 1/2 and 3. So that means that you're going to just set up a little equation that 1/2, or x is basically in between 1/2 and 3. Where X is going to be the amount that you trade for one cheese in milk. So you could have a trade of 2. You could have one cheese for 2 milk, and that would be a beneficial trade for both parties. That's basically it. It's not too hard. And that's it. That's comparative advantage in trade and the production possibilities curve. I'll see you later in the next video where we will go into supply and demand.